Unit 6. Individual Differences. Presentation 4. The Behavioural Approach to Psychopathology.
The behavioural approach is one of the 3 psychological approaches to psychopathology that you will have studied. As you may also remember from your studies, psychopathology refers to those behaviours or experiences that indicate the existence of a mental disorder. Psychologists who subscribe to the behavioural view of psychopathology believe that abnormality is a consequence of learning rather than physical factors.
In fact, behaviourists believe that all human behaviour is learned, but whereas most of our learned behaviour is helpful to us, some is not. Learned behaviours that aren't helpful to us, or which get in the way of us living a normal life, are referred to as maladaptive behaviours. Learning to avoid situations that cause us distress might appear perfectly reasonable, but not if this avoidance prevents us from dealing with everyday situations. Let's begin by looking at some of the key features of this approach.
The key features of the behavioural approach to psychopathology. The key feature of this approach is that abnormal behaviours are learned behaviours that are maladaptive for the individual. Abnormal behaviours are no different to other, more normal behaviours in terms of how they are acquired. The important difference is that normal behaviour is about learning appropriate responses to stimuli, whereas maladaptive behaviour is all about learning inappropriate responses to the same stimuli.
The second key feature is the role of classical conditioning in the development of abnormal behaviours. We can acquire maladaptive behaviours in many different ways. The first of these is through classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is a form of learning whereby 2 stimuli become associated together. This can explain the development of simple emotional responses, such as the response of fear to stimuli associated with painful or frightening events.
Could you give an example of that?
Okay, I recently read about a woman who had an irrational fear of snow. She would become anxious and fearful whenever it snowed, and even thinking about snow created great anxiety for her. She had essentially developed a phobia for snow, or chionophobia, if you want the technical term. It turns out that some years earlier she had been caught in an avalanche and had nearly lost her life. The terrifying ordeal of the avalanche had become associated with snow generally, and so whenever she encountered snow in the future, she felt the same sense of terror. In classical conditioning terms, the neutral stimulus of snow had become associated with the unconditioned stimulus of the avalanche, with the result that the snow became a conditioned stimulus, leading to a conditioned response of fear and anxiety.
The third key feature is the role of operant conditioning in the development of abnormal behaviours. Operant conditioning is an explanation of learning that predicts that a particular behaviour will become more frequent if it leads to desirable consequences. Through the process of operant conditioning, we learn behaviours that lead to positive consequences such as praise and approval. We also learn behaviours that enable us to escape from or avoid negative events, such as pain and disapproval. Over time, these behaviours may become habits, but not all habits are good ones. For example, habitually avoiding difficult circumstances may prevent individuals from dealing effectively with life stressors.
The fourth key feature is the role of social learning in the development of abnormal behaviours. Social learning theorists expanded the traditional learning approach by including learning by observation, something they referred to as modelling. For example, snake phobia may be acquired as a result of observing the fearful reactions of others. So, if a child sees a parent acting in a frightened way whenever they see a snake, they pick up that behaviour as an appropriate reaction.
The fifth key feature is the emphasis on abnormal behaviour rather than any underlying causes. For example, someone with fear of spiders, arachnophobia, may display great anxiety in the presence of spiders. This extreme reaction to something that's essentially harmless is seen as being learned through conditioning or social learning rather than being inherited or due to any other underlying cause.
So, let me summarise all that. According to this approach, abnormal behaviours are learned through classical or operant conditioning or through social learning, and the focus is on the behaviour rather than any underlying cause.
Evaluating the behavioural approach. The behavioural approach to psychopathology represents a very limited view of the origins of abnormality. It ignores the role of biological and cognitive factors, both of which have been shown to be important in mental illness. For example, the behavioural approach suggests that phobias are learned. However, research has shown that there may be a genetic basis. In fact, an increasing number of mental disorders have been shown to have genetic origins. This challenges the view that such disorders are acquired through learning alone.
A second problem with this approach is that some stimuli are more likely to produce maladaptive responses than are others. The vast majority of phobias develop toward particular types of stimuli and situations. For example, heights, snakes, and closed spaces where escape would be difficult. These stimuli would have been linked to survival among our distant ancestors, and therefore learning to avoid them was crucial. Among modern humans, these usually develop without any significant experiences with those stimuli or those situations, making the learning explanation inappropriate.
Experiences that should lead to mental disorders frequently don't. A learning explanation would suggest that traumatic or painful experiences should lead to the development of an anxiety disorder, such as a phobia related to that event. However, most of the time this doesn't happen. For example, most of us have managed to burn ourselves on a hot pan or managed to give ourselves an electric shock, yet few, if any of us, have developed phobias of pans or electrical sockets. This suggests that adverse learning experiences do not necessarily lead to the development of phobias.
Perhaps the most significant strength of this approach is that its predictions can be tested scientifically. For example, researchers have successfully used the principles of learning theory to create symptoms of mental disorders in laboratory participants, suggesting that mental disorders may well develop in the same way. However, because these symptoms are created in an artificial environment, this cannot be taken as indisputable evidence that real disorders are acquired as a result of inappropriate conditioning or social learning.
Another strength of this approach comes from the success of treatments based on learning principles. If psychological disorders are a consequence of learning maladaptive behaviours, then the same principles can be effective in unlearning these behaviours and replacing them with behaviours that are more healthy and more adaptive. This is the aim of behavioural treatments. Such treatments have been effective in helping people with phobias, depression, and a host of other problems. This suggests that perhaps these problems had been a consequence of maladaptive learning in the first place, exactly as predicted by the behavioural approach. What can we conclude? At the beginning of this presentation, we suggested that according to the behavioural approach, abnormality is the product of maladaptive learning. This places it in direct contrast to many of the other approaches that you will study, each of which concentrates on the underlying causes of a behaviour rather than the behaviour itself.